Now, Huples cat, how many people die of COVID-19 disease? Did you know the answer is actually fairly straightforward? And yet that's the way everybody's doing it, aren't they? How many cases have been diagnosed today or yesterday or 2 days before, or accumulation of the last week in one day? How many of those people do we know died? Mostly in hospitals. Sometimes we also add in care homes because sometimes we think old people are valuable. So what we get is a bunch of people we've tested for COVID-19 disease. We find the SARS-CoV-2 virus in some of them, so they're now labelled infected. And of those, some of them are admitted to hospital, some of them get sick, some of them die. So we look at the number of people labelled COVID-19 disease for either blood tests or clinical symptoms and how many of them died. And then we go, well, there's been X number of people died. Now, that's what everybody's doing, isn't it? Breathless excitement. Let's follow how many people have been diagnosed because they were fortunate to be tested by a test that worked. Testing's a little problematic, and then died. So this has led to a whole bunch of issues. The United States of America, a whole bunch of people are convinced that their numbers are far, far higher and inflated than the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is that we're not capturing anywhere near enough people that are dying from this. So how do you figure out how many people have died from COVID-19 disease? The answer is actually very, very straightforward. So of course the statistics are a little hard to find, but here we go. That's the average deaths in the United States of America from all causes, and it's almost 8,000. Not bad. We've got 350 million people down there, so that's not bad. And then average deaths day by day from influenza, it's 161. The average deaths from COVID-19 is 868, but the average on that actual day was 1,115, so you can see that it's almost 9.5% to 10% higher than seasonal influenza, and therefore that's how we're all treating COVID-19. In our efforts to pin down exactly what the issue is with COVID-19, we've looked at COVID-19 to see how many people died from COVID-19. And that might make sense to you, but it doesn't make sense to me. I don't see that as a very easy thing to calculate. It's very hard to decide if somebody in a nursing home has died from normal progressive heart disease and maybe a bit of an influenza, or whether COVID-19 actually went in there and killed them. And I think that's kind of the important point, is what's your chance of dying from COVID-19? If you look at COVID-19 deaths and COVID-19 infection rates, you're going to underestimate your personal chance of death from COVID-19 disease. There isn't much statistics, it's starting to come out, and I've been waiting for this. I've been telling people all along, the numbers are irrelevant. It is worse than influenza and it kills. People like me take precautions, and I still stick to that. But what we're actually starting to now see is the actual baseline national and geographical death rates. Okay, so bear with me with this. Say in an average week 10 people die in your town. Say last week 15 people died. You can assume that the percent rise is caused by an external factor, COVID-19 disease in this case, especially because a lot of us are in lockdown. So the traumatic injuries and the normal injuries of running around and driving at speed on crowded roads, all of those have reduced. Okay, there might be some marginal increase in suicides, though it's early on in this disease for that. So what I'm saying is, if you look at your actual death rate, how high that is above the normal baseline for this time of year, placed over a few years, is going to give you a very strong clue into two things. One, how many people are dying from COVID-19, directly or indirectly. Whether it kills you directly or indirectly is somewhat irrelevant, it still killed you. And how much underreporting is happening. And from what I'm seeing, underreporting is a definitive thing. So the much maligned CDC, which had an 80% budget reduction under the Trump administration, of course you can look at the more affected states because you're going to see the effect. So you can't say this is the same for all of the states of America, so everybody has this amount of rise. But it's interesting to look at it. So they looked at the big ones, and they looked at New York City as independent from New York State for obvious reasons, because it's having a huge issue. So what they found looking at the 7 hardest hit states of the United States of America up until the 7th of April, so this is early on in this, very early on, they found a 50% rise above normal baseline deaths. That is mega. That is massive. This is why people like me have been saying for quite some time, this is not something to dismiss. This is not seasonal flu. The rates are between 10 to 20 times death rate from normal seasonal flu. What they're capturing in the data is about a 9 to 10% times worse than seasonal flu, which is terrible. However, they might be underreporting. They might be underreporting by a factor of 50%. So this might be 15 times more killing than a normal seasonal flu. That is a huge issue. So I've been saying it's underreported in every country, and this again will show this. There are states that have had 0 deaths reported because they haven't actually processed the death certificates yet, right? And in a state of confusion where undertakers and funeral directors are being very busy and the doctors are being very busy, it actually takes a much longer period of time to process paper death certificates. In most places, death certificate notification is paper. In Ontario and in Toronto, we moved to electronic about 3 or 4 weeks ago in anticipation of a huge rise from COVID-19 disease, so we actually have faster data. But interestingly, I can't find any Canadian recent death certificates from 2019, let alone from 2020. So I'm going to show you a series of slides based on the same data, just to show you how data can be misinterpreted or changed or altered visually to make you look different. So the slides that I'm showing is all from the same data, okay? So when we look at this, what you're seeing is a representation of the rise above normal baseline deaths in the 7 states as reported by the CDC. If you can, always look at the numbers. The numbers usually are fairly straightforward, though numbers can be fudged as well. But what we see here is reported to normal above baseline and excess deaths. So what we are expecting is that all of the deaths that have occurred abnormally have caused directly or indirectly by COVID-19, and there's the gap. Bearing in mind that we're expecting deaths to actually drop during the early phase of a lockdown quite dramatically, but some people won't seek hospital treatment and would die who would otherwise wouldn't die, and etc, etc. But overall, deaths will be lower in the early part of a lockdown from a pandemic. And this is a somewhat busy one, but it just graphically shows you that the 7 affected states, including the city of New York City as a separate in a state, if you like, are showing their rise above baseline, and the baseline is for the last 5 years. So normally for this time of year, for each of the last 5 years, and what's happened this year. So you have to wonder when you look at data points like this, hey, there is no graph axis, okay? So how you've set the axis can make the data look either flat or dramatic. But if you're using the same axis for all of these, obviously New York City is having it far worse than most other places, but you don't know that that's what they've actually done. So data like this is easy to look at and conveys a strong message, but really should probably be dismissed. Now here's a much better representation of this. It's looking at New York City, New York and New Jersey, the worst affected areas initially, and then we'll look at the other 5. The New York City, the axis is the same. So the number of dead is actually the same on all of the graphs, which gives you a much stronger representation of the excess compared to the normal type of graph that we were looking at before, because it's a lot easier to see that some states are badly affected and some aren't. Now Washington State, it's almost not touched. They have excess deaths, but it's not a huge amount. And, you know, an extra 50 or 100 deaths in a big state is not a huge deal. But obviously 6,000, 6,500 deaths in New York City, that's a huge impact. So there's reasonably good data in this as well for the United Kingdom, England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. What they're finding is approximately 71% of the excess deaths are being labelled as directly or indirectly related to COVID-19 deaths. So they actually have a 29% higher than baseline death rate during a prolonged period of lockdown where people are not dying as often, and that is a significant thing. So the death rate seems to be at least at 30%, 29% higher from COVID-19 in the United Kingdom than what you might assume looking at the number of people labelled as having died from COVID-19. Now using the United States data, you can look at this graph and you can quite clearly see the dark brown is actually COVID-19 deaths that have been reported, and the light brown above that is the actual excess number of people that have died in the United States over that normal period of time, and how many people have died in addition to what you would normally expect to see. So the excess deaths above this are actually what we would assume are directly or indirectly caused by COVID-19. Now I think if I'm having a heart attack and I don't go to hospital because I'm frightened of catching COVID-19, I would blame COVID-19 for that death. That could be arguable. But what is crazy is people are out there claiming that COVID-19 has been overreported, that it's actually not what we're seeing from the data. It's some magical thinking that says, hey, for every 500 COVID reported deaths, only by maybe 5 or 50 or 100 of them or 400 of them are actually COVID-19. People are making it up and just writing COVID-19 down on the death certificates out of laziness. But what the data clearly shows is that there are more people dying, probably from COVID-19 directly or indirectly, a lot more people dying in the United States and in Great Britain than is actually being reported by the official data that's looking to capture COVID-19. So again, with most of the conspiracy stuff, there is some factual reality to this, that some people are being labelled as COVID-19 or double reported in more than one state. That happens. But the truth of it is, we're faced with a large underreporting of between, we don't know until we get a lot of data from a lot of countries over a lot of period of time. At the moment, we're looking at between a 25 to a 50, possibly a 60% underreporting of deaths from COVID-19. And I find that significant. I still think even if there was no overreporting and there was a bit of underreporting, etc., I still think the death rate being 10 times normal, higher than normal seasonal flu, is somewhat significant. And the fact is, normal healthy people who don't normally get seasonal flu, some people do and die from it every year, some people do every year die from that, but a lot more people like me and Kitty are catching it and dying from it than you would expect. That is why this is a pandemic. This is why the governments all across the world are locking down. And they're not locking down out of spite or to take away your rights. They're doing it to stop you from catching it and dying. That's it from me. Not great news. I haven't had any great news out of COVID-19 for a long time. Becky's been up most of the night, as she does, because we've tried not to sleep with her because she's terrible to sleep with, because she tends to stand on your throat. Anyway, it wasn't a success, so I suspect I'll be sleeping with her again tonight. I'm trying to keep her away from me with pillows, which doesn't work very well. But Mr. Bear's had a good sleep, even if the rest of us haven't. But I did get to see sunrise. Cold out there today. Today will be the day we will start to do some gardening, I think. So remember, SHTF, tomorrow will always be worse than today, unless you prep. And in a pandemic, tomorrow will always be worse than today, until we've actually passed the peak, and we're nowhere near the first peak. Anyway, Mr. Bear now wants to go out. Hello, Mr. Bear. Say hi. Oh, he's a happy boy. Toodles. One out, and one in. Come on, Becky. So this is kind of a bonus end to this video for those people that actually watch the entire video. I just want to say that you need to keep cheerful and you need to try and have a sense of purpose and not try to get overwhelmed with depression. This is merely an historical pandemic that we're experiencing in our lifetime. It is not the end of the world. It is not the end of everything. It's going to be majorly impactful on your lives. Now that sounds crazy because this is the first week of May and it's been very, very impactful. I'm suspecting it's going to be much more impactful than it has been to this day. It's going to be a struggle. It's going to be unpleasant and it's going to be brutally hard. But you can find happiness and connection, and you need to. You need to keep a sense of proportion. If we lose 2% of all the population, that's a terrible, terrible blow. It isn't anything much in terms of how we can go on from that. It will go on, the Dow will recover, jobs will be recreated, and people will build houses properly again. We need to be happy and we need to be mentally strong and spiritually strong for those people who believe in God or gods, and we need to help each other out. This is not the time for psychotic prepping, hiding with guns, ready to kill people. A pandemic is a different SHTF event from any other. This level of death rate from COVID-19 disease is not as bad as it could be. This will not end society. If people try and end society because of panic and fear and anger, I suspect the governments are strong enough to stop them from doing that. Toodles. This has been a very naughty terrier production 2020.